If you're like me and you like flying indoors, or you're looking for something that can easily be flown indoors, then one of these ultralight tinywhoops might be the best option for you. Hey everyone, it's Mark with Crate and Captivate, and in this video I'm going to be comparing these two 65mm bind and fly quads. And you may already know what these are. This is the Happymodel Mobula6 2024, and this is the BetaFPV Air65 Freestyle Edition. And these were both released about 6 months ago, so they are relatively new and arguably still the best bind and fly whoops in this size and weight class. Now, I only recently got into flying these 65mm tiny whoops because I wanted something that I could fly indoors. And over the past few months, I've flown these a lot, mainly because it's winter and most days the weather isn't ideal for flying outside. But these things can be a ton of fun, and there's really a lot you can do in a relatively small space. So even someone like me who's fairly new to FPV in general, I was able to become proficient enough to fly around indoors no problem in a short amount of time. And these things are great for learning because you can crash them over and over and they don't seem to break. Well, they will eventually, and I'll come back to that when I talk more about my flying experience with each of these. But first, I want to quickly go over some of the specs to point out some of the differences and also a few things that I think make these better than some of the other options out there. So I have here the Happymodel Mobula6 2024 and the BetaFPV Air65 Freestyle Edition. These are both 65mm 1S tiny whoops, and on my scale, the Mobula6 weighs 17.69 grams and the Air65 weighs 17.25 grams. So the Mobula6 is slightly heavier, but I'm not sure if it actually makes a noticeable difference, and that's something I'll talk more about in the flight videos. Now, the Mobula6 has a 5-in-1 flight controller with a built-in ELRS receiver, and my Air65 has a 4-in-1 flight controller with an external ELRS receiver. And I've had no issues with the 4-in-1 board, but there is now a 5-in-1 board available with a built-in receiver. Now, that's for the controller, and for video, they both have a built-in 5.8 GHz VTX that will output from 25 milliwatts up to 400 milliwatts. And that's nice because some of the other options out there are limited to only 25 milliwatts, which in my case works fine indoors, but if you're flying outdoors, 400 milliwatts should give you better range. Now for cameras, the Mobula6 has an FX17-B camera with a 1/3 inch CMOS sensor and a 150-degree field of view. And the Air65 has a BetaFPV CO3 camera, which also has a 1/3 inch CMOS sensor, but a 160-degree field of view. And you will see in the flight footage that there is a noticeable difference in the cameras. Now for props and motors, the Mobula6 comes with Gemfan 31mm tri-blade props mounted on Happymodel SE0702 28,000 kV motors. And the Air65 comes with HQ 31mm tri-blade props mounted on BetaFPV 0702 SE 23,000 kV motors. And what's interesting about that is I find the lower kV motors of the Air65 to be more responsive than the higher kV motors of the Mobula6, which is something I'll talk more about during the flight videos. For battery connectors, the Mobula6 has an A30 connector and the Air65 has a BT 2.0 U connector. And I like the U connector on the Air65 because it makes it much easier to connect the batteries. But both of these connectors will work with A30 or BT 2.0 batteries. And that's another thing I like about these because I have both types of batteries and they are interchangeable, whereas other connectors are not. And the batteries I have been using are these Lava 260s and 300s, which are BT 2.0, and these G&B 300s, which are A30. And if you want to know which of these I prefer, it's the Lava 260s. And I'll talk more about batteries and flight times in the flight videos. But the last thing I want to point out is the flight controller programming port. On the Mobula6, there's this micro USB port, which is pretty standard for flight controllers. But you will notice on the Air65, there's just this 4-pin connector. So you will need to use an adapter that does come with the Air65, and it has a 4-pin connector on one end and a USB-C port on the other. And it does plug in and unplug quite easy, so for the amount I use it, I don't find it to be a big hassle. Just don't lose it, that's the main thing. And that's enough about specs. Let's get into some flight videos and I'll talk about my experience flying each of these. So first, I just want to mention, like I said earlier, you will notice a difference between the two cameras. And I'm not exactly sure what it is. It's like the Mobula6 has a higher exposure and a cooler image, whereas the Air65 appears to have a warmer, more sharpened image. But ultimately, I think the image quality from both cameras is quite sufficient for flying around. Another thing you'll notice is there is a minimal amount of breakup on both video signals. And I don't think either one is any better or worse. I typically have the VTX set to 100 milliwatts, and I find that gives me a fairly clean signal. I do get a bit more breakup at 25 milliwatts, and that's why it's nice to be able to raise the VTX output. But even still, at 25 milliwatts, I can fly down into my basement when I'm 2 floors above with only minor breakup in the video. Now, when it comes to flying them, in my opinion, the Air65 and Mobula6 both fly very well. I find they were both relatively easy to maintain controlled flight, and they both have plenty of power when you need it. Now that being said, the flight characteristics of each are quite different. And what I mean by that is there is a difference in the responsiveness to stick movements. So it may not be obvious in the flight video, but you do feel it on the controls. And that's what I was referring to earlier when I said the lower kV motors of the Air65 seem to be more responsive. And in fact, the Air65 just feels to be more locked on in general. So it will go exactly where you direct it, but that also means you have to be very precise with your stick movements to get it to fly smoothly. On the other hand, the Mobula6 is a bit less responsive, and therefore it's easier to fly smoothly if your stick inputs aren't super precise. So as someone that is fairly new to this, I found it easier to learn on the Mobula6 because it wasn't quite as responsive and seemed a bit more forgiving. And that's likely something to do with the PID tune, but I just leave it as it is because I don't know enough about that. However, I did change my rates from the default, but I used the same rates for both the Air65 and the Mobula6, so they were similar in that sense. And I have to say, after flying probably a few hundred packs on these, I have started to build that muscle memory, and my stick inputs are much more controlled and smoother than they used to be. So I do now prefer the more locked-in feel of the Air65. Now, something else that I mentioned earlier, or at least hinted at, was the durability of these things. And I have to say, both of these are incredibly durable. I did actually break my first Mobula6, but it was the first one I got, and I literally crashed it hundreds of times. And when it broke, it basically just stopped flying. I could arm it and it would fly for a couple seconds, then it would just die and fall out of the air. Other than that, I only ever bent one prop. And I had lots of hard crashes. In fact, with both of these I have. Like full speed into the walls, ceiling, floor, furniture, you name it. Sometimes it's just like a game of pinball bouncing off of things. So I certainly can't complain about the durability of either of these. And also the fact that they weigh only about 25 grams with a battery. Unless you hit something super fragile, they're not going to damage anything either. Now, another thing you might be wondering is what kind of flight times you get with each of these. And overall, the Mobula6 did get shorter flight times, likely due to the higher kV motors. But also depending on how I was flying and which batteries I was using, the flight times did vary a fair bit. So with the Lava 260s, I would get roughly between 3.5 to 4 minutes with the Air65 and about 20 seconds less with the Mobula6. And with the Lava 300s, I would only get 15, maybe 20 seconds more, because they are over a gram heavier, which is fairly significant at this size, so the flight times aren't that much longer. And they are a longer battery, so they stick out a lot more than the 260s do. Now, the G&B 300s were the lightest and smallest batteries, but also got the shortest flight times, by about 30 to 40 seconds. So I do prefer the Lava batteries, and I like the extra flight time of the 300s, but I do prefer the size of the 260s. So overall, I think both the Happymodel Mobula6 2024 and the BetaFPV Air65 are excellent options for something that can be easily flown inside. They both have the durability that make them good for someone like me that was just learning, and they have the performance for doing freestyle if you have the skill. But if I were to pick one over the other, I would have to say the Air65 would be my choice. And it is cheaper. I paid $169.99 Canadian for my Mobula6 and $136.99 for my Air65. Now, I still think the Mobula6 might be a better tiny whoop to learn on because it is a bit more forgiving on the controls, and I did prefer it for a while until I got a lot more proficient at flying. So hopefully this video has been helpful if you were trying to decide on a new tiny whoop or looking for something to fly indoors. But that's all I have, so thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one.